Hitler had been calling the Russians weak, so Stalin tried to show the world that he was tough and strong, and that show of ruthlessness made many Russians welcome the Germans as liberators when Barbarossa got underway. The German army had thought Russia would be a pushover after Russians had quit in the middle of the Great War, and the Germans were actually welcomed with open arms into the motherland at first, in the summer of 1941, seen as saviors from Stalin's harsh demands. But when the SS Einsatzgruppen began shooting their beloved Jewish commissars, the Russians turned against the German invaders. Added to that confusion, the German army was slowed down, having to wait for the SS Einsatzgruppen to catch up, and then it started to snow. Hitler sent an additional 500,000 soldiers in September of 1942 to take Stalingrad, and it took only a few months to kill 300,000 of them, while the rest were swallowed up as prisoners. And there had been a lull in deportations that summer in 1942 as the fight against Russia had taken priority, and at that time 80% of Jews in the camps were still alive and 20% had died. And after the defeat of Stalingrad, those figures would reverse. Only 100,000 people had left Germany by the beginning of 1938, and they were those who had enough money to travel. And when they arrived at a new place, people would wonder why they hadn't been allowed to stay in Germany, and would begin to suspect that perhaps they were criminals after all. Only 500 Jews had come to America in 1933 when the quota was over 25,000, and some Jews who left Germany turned around and went right back. Hollywood Jews in the movie-making business had come from Poland and Russia and Germany and had been speaking out against Hitler until Joe Kennedy came out to California and told them to knock it off, because he thought that Americans would blame Hollywood Jews if America had to go to war with Germany, and the Hollywood Jews took his advice and shut up about Hitler. As soon as Germany ran out of German Jews to plunder, the economy began to falter, and the decline could no longer be blamed on the parasitic German Jews bleeding Germany dry, so it had to be that the blood-sucking Jews were now sabotaging Germany from outside its borders, where they had fled with their secreted wealth. Consequently, Hitler set his sights on Jews living in France, but the French Jews turned out to be as disappointing as all the others in terms of coughing up money. Things were getting worse in Germany because countless doctors and lawyers and businessmen had been driven out of the fatherland, and the idea that the Jews had sent their wealth to Russia appeared to be the answer, since the Jews in Austria had not coughed up much wealth either, so they all must have been shipping their gold to the East. The resistance groups and partisan fighters were invariably led by Jews still active as community organizers for the communist revolutions, and their agitating against the government brought harsh reprisals, and in the spring of 1942, the clever Germans built mobile gas chambers to deal with them so the trains could be freed up for use by the military. As the German army marched forward into Russia, the plundering of Soviet Jews proved no more profitable than in the other countries, so Hitler wondered if perhaps the Jews had sent their gold to the Pope in Rome for safe storage. The Italians had been former German subjects in the previous Reich, and when the British told the Germans that the Americans were landing in Italy, German soldiers understood this to mean that the Americans knew about the hidden Jewish treasure in Rome, and Germans dedicated their last breath to stopping the Americans from finding that Jewish gold in the Vatican before the Germans could send it home to Hitler. This was where the Jews must have hidden all their Jewish wealth, right under the Pope's nose. It had to be, because the Italians had been allowed to put Jews into camps without deporting them, and so the Germans started shipping Italian Jews to Auschwitz for interrogation purposes as soon as the Americans beat the British into Rome. The Nazis never did find the Pope's gold, and not for want of trying, and the tragedy of not finding the Vatican's gold would be the turning point of the war, and as the Americans proved to be unstoppable, blame shifted to that Jew Morgenthau and the rest of the Jews running America, and many more people began calling FDR's economic plan the Jew Deal. As the war continued, Eichmann's boss Heydrich was assassinated in May of 1942, and the camps evolved into extermination centers as no country was willing to accept any of the Jews being shipped off to the camps, where it was supposed that they were being given some honest work for a change. Great Britain was especially disinclined to accept them, and Heydrich told Eichmann all about the British plot to kill Hitler in Munich back on the 8th of November in 1939 with the 2 British spies on the Dutch border that was called the Venlo Incident. Eichmann and the Zionists got along really well and had a common enemy in the British, who were opposed to Jews settling in Israel. And in the Nazi government in Germany, there were 2 sides to the division to which Eichmann belonged. One side dealing with sects or organized churches that included Freemasons and Jesuits, and the other department was responsible for hunting down communists and liberals, or the worldwide international Jew. Eichmann chose the former, where he could be in contact with his friends in the Zionist movement, and Archbishop Pacelli had staunchly opposed communism, not merely because it was anti-Christian, but because it challenged the power of the church by considering the state to be above God. So the original Nazis cooperated with the churches, but as the church people began to complain about the treatment of Jews, the Nazis turned against the church. In Yugoslavia, 5,000 Jews had joined the Chetniks to fight both the communists and the Nazis, and Britain forced the Americans to stop supporting the Chetniks at the Tehran Conference in 1943, and while these Jews were fighting alongside the Chetniks, their wives and children were being killed in gassing vans in Serbia. Not only Jews, but brain-damaged soldiers went into the gas chambers, and then less seriously wounded soldiers started disappearing. And when German people began asking too many questions, that's when the secrecy started up. It could have been kept secret longer if those involved weren't in the habit of getting drunk and bragging in the beer halls, but it didn't matter because nobody was terribly offended by their work. The Jews Eichmann was sending to be exterminated were those who did not want to move to Palestine. And when some in the foreign press accused the Germans of deliberately starving prisoners to death, they were told that there was simply not enough food because of the war, and blamed the enemy for having bombed the supply trains. The starving people in the camps at the end of the war were not such a big surprise, because there were plenty of starving people all around in those days, since the science and technology of food preservation had yet to emerge very far, not to mention the omnipresent food and waterborne diseases. It did not take long for fleeing people to starve, because food was mostly on the hoof or growing in the fields, and the idea had naturally evolved that it was morally superior to kill the migrant Jews than to let them starve, and so while it had not been the initial intention to murder all the Jews, it simply happened to be the best thing that the Germans could do for them. The army needed trains for carrying troops and supplies and munitions. So transporting more and more Jews to the work camps to replace the ones dying of typhus had been interfering with the war effort, and the overcrowded camps were turning trainloads of prisoners away. So there seemed to be no other solution than to submit the overflow prisoners to mercy killing, but it had not been a straightforward conclusion. Zyklon B was for the killing of lice. Zyklon B was for killing lice omnipresent in the unwashed travelers, and one day the German emptying the can into the delousing chamber had slipped, and the whole can of Zyklon B went in, and the while the result was tragic, one German thought it was just what Germany needed, and he told the other Germans to gather some sick prisoners together and put them in the disinfectant chamber, and after several experiments they figured out how many cans would kill a whole room full of people, and the final solution was born. As people were disposed of and then incinerated in the scientific concentration camps, more room opened up for more victims whose bank accounts and home equity went directly into the Reich treasury, and Hitler was able to spend more and more state money improving the lives of ordinary Germans. Hitler had built the Autobahn right away, and the same thing had been going on in America, putting state money to good use. And this was not capitalism, but something like industrial socialism, and it was not considered communism in America, as long as there remained an upper class and a middle class and a working class, along with an entire class of domestic servants. No profit was being made in building the Autobahn or in the enterprises of the CCC, including the construction of the Hoover Dam. And without the profit motive, that meant that the incentive to streamline costs was gone, and those abusing the privilege of working for the state by lining their own pockets in Germany found it not just a reason to be fired, but a criminal offense that got them sent off to a processing center and thence to a concentration camp. So many Nazis were making money on the resettlement of Jews, getting them to pay for waivers or exceptions to deportation orders, then turning them in to get deported anyway, that Eichmann's efficiency was interfering with their profits, so his work was often sabotaged and interfered with. Not only were his men being frequently fired or murdered, but his superiors were constantly being replaced. Eichmann had to obtain clearance from the army if the trains entered a theater of war. The army could veto transports. What Dieter Visceleni did not tell, and what is perhaps more interesting, is that the army used its right of veto only in the initial years when German troops were on the offensive. In 1944, when the deportations from Hungary clogged the lines of retreat for whole German armies in desperate flight, no vetoes were forthcoming. Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil by Hannah Arendt, New York Penguin Books, 1963-1984, page 213. Shipments of prisoners were loaded and unloaded in a never-ending effort to make the camp system work, and people suffered epidemics of disease as well as lack of food and clothes and water, and instead of becoming useful as factories, the camps struggled to simply store people until orders would arrive to move them somewhere else. As the war went on, the situation in the concentration camps went from bad to worse, and Hitler would spend hours on the phone trying to make the camps more effective and efficient, because National Socialism depended on their success. The labor camps were not just for manufacturing materials and munitions for Germany, but were supposed to be resettlement centers where people from outside Germany could be brought in and assimilated so that they could contribute to the culture and economy of the Reich. The camps were mismanaged, but it had become something more like official policy to actually make the inmates suffer, either as an incentive to work harder or as a warning to traitors to the fatherland that punitive measures could be taken against them. The bad management was done more often from a hope that other countries would step in to offer the prisoners refuge, preferably at a good price, and then releasing them would advertise to the world how beneficent, and generous was the government of Germany. The U.S. had a policy of not accepting immigrants who were likely to become a public charge, and as the Nazi government squeezed the last drop of wealth out of Jews, they became increasingly more likely to need financial assistance if brought over to America. The war was cutting American resources to the bone, and FDR refused to pay ransom for Jewish lives because he needed to win the war and thought that Germany would only use the money to ratchet up the fighting against Americans.